the reason why cholesterol has been labeled as a unhealthy or bad molecule for you. And if you look at this, where does it come from? So, well, back in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a scientist called Ancel Keys. He was an epidemiologist and a physiologist, and he was trying to find an explanation why there was, at that point, there was a very rapid increase in heart attacks, cardiovascular disease. So one of the explanations, there was this big debate, what is the food, but if it's the food, what is it in the food that causes it? So there were some people who were arguing for sugar, some people were arguing for fat. So Ancel Keys was one of them that was arguing for fat. And he came up with it, it was called, nowadays it's still called the diet-heart hypothesis. So the diet-heart hypothesis proposed the following. If you eat saturated fats, meat, chicken or poultry, dairy, so these are animal products that contain saturated fat, increases the level of cholesterol in the circulation. If that happens, cholesterol clogs your arteries and causes cardiovascular disease. That was the hypothesis. To support this hypothesis, Ancel Keys, he did what is famous for, it's known as the 7-country study. He picked 7 countries, most of them in Europe and Japan, in Asia, and he did a correlation between the intake of saturated fat and the incidence of cardiovascular disease. So he looked at these populations in different countries, and most of them were Europe and Japan. And he looked at how much they ate of saturated fat and did a correlation. And then he found in the 7, if he stuck to only 7 countries, he could get a very nice correlation. In other words, the more saturated fat, higher the number of deaths. So there was a correlation there, direct or a positive correlation there. Now, one thing that he did that was problematic is that he picked and chose only those countries that were actually convenient for his hypothesis. So he actually did cherry picking, that we say in science, or even when you are only picking those things that are convenient, you say, oh, you're cherry picking this argument or this thing. Because there were more than 20 countries. And when you put them all together, you would find that there was no relationship between the intake of cholesterol or saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. The relation disappeared. But he obviously ignored all that and only stuck to those 7 countries because that was favorable to what he was trying to promote, which was the diet-heart hypothesis. So it turns out that Ancel Keys was very influential, and he had a lot of connections with governments and the pharmaceutical industry. And he actually promoted this, and he sold this idea. And people quickly bought into that. Not only that, once the pharmaceutical industry designed and developed a drug that actually reduces cholesterol, now it makes total sense for us to promote this idea that cholesterol is a problem, because now I can sell my drug. So in the end, what prevailed was this combination of this financial interest the pharmaceutical industry had with his, I would say, dishonest approach to science, because this is a fraud. And this is quite well known. If you go, again, you don't need to trust me, go online, and you can go on PubMed, and you can go on Google, and you can read for yourself. You'll see the history behind this. It's a lot more that we don't usually hear. People don't tell us. But that's the story behind why we look at cholesterol and we say that cholesterol is bad. Or at least there's this idea, very, I would say, impregnated in the minds of the population that cholesterol is a problem. Look at this graph. Here we have the consumption of fat per capita per day. Here we have heart disease deaths in thousands. And here we have time in decades. So if you look from 1900s, or 1910, all the way to 2010, you look at the saturated fat consumption, the triangular line, didn't change much. It's pretty much constant, right? Now, if you look at heart disease deaths, this dashed line, look at this. 1910, then it starts to go up, all the way to what we have now. So why is it that saturated fat didn't change, but heart disease changed quite a bit? Deaths increased a lot. So it doesn't seem to be that we can explain this based on saturated fat intake. Because, again, these are correlations. We cannot make assumptions based on correlations because they can be just two things happening simultaneously, but they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But there could be something to do with each other. We need to test it. Now look at the intake of vegetable oils, which is the polyunsaturated fat, this idea that you have to avoid saturated fat and substitute it for unsaturated fat. Because saturated fat is bad for you because it increases the diet heart hypothesis that we discussed before. So now, if you look at the data, it tells you that there seems to be more. If I were to pick something here to study or to test, I would not pick saturated fat, I would pick vegetable oil because that's what seems to go along with the idea that there is an increase in consumption and increase in cardiovascular death. Actually, because this is, again, a correlation, we can really attribute cause and effect.